again, this book really is a great book, and read it in the way you see fit. Page through it. Read it. Read the parts that are like this. Read what you want. Get a sense of it. That's what the book's for. But one thing I want to point out that I find particularly interesting, which I think exemplifies, first of all, his optimism, McLuhan's optimism, but also points to some of the more typical ethical questions or concerns that we have in our time. First, he says this: our time is a time for crossing barriers, for erasing old categories, for probing around. I mean, that's the optimistic and joyful McLuhan. And I think he was right then. And I think we would be right now to say that. That is, we do live in such a time. We are crossing barriers in all sorts of ways, not just technological barriers, but social, political, societal, sociological, aesthetic barriers, or barriers. All I mean, it is a time for probing around, and that's a good time. That's an interesting time. A time for innovation and imagination. But then there's this, put in a kind of a jokey way, but raising some serious concerns. He says, "How much do you make? Have you ever contemplated suicide? Are you now, or have you ever been?" That's an echo of the McCarthyite interrogations of the 50s. "Are you aware of the fact I have here before me electrical information devices for universal tyrannical womb-to-tomb surveillance are causing a very serious dilemma between our claim to privacy and the community's need to know." I mean, that could be written today. And the possibilities of surveillance, the possibilities of the advances or changes in media technology, communications technology, go hand in hand with possibilities for surveillance and for oppression. The older traditional ideas of private, isolated thoughts and actions, the patterns of mechanistic technologies, are very seriously threatened by new methods of instantaneous electric information retrieval, by the electrically computerized dossier bank, that one big gossip column that is unforgiving, unforgetful, and from which there is no redemption, no erasure of early, quote, mistakes. That is pretty remarkable, considering that there was nothing like social media in the late 60s when he wrote this. That is a very topical, current concern. The idea that, from an old guy's point of view who doesn't use social media, to some extent, that's what social media looks like. A huge gossip column that's unforgiving and unforgetful, and from which there is no redemption, no erasure of early, quote, mistakes. I'm sure you were given the talk about the dangers of social media and being careful with the kind of pictures that you upload to your account and how they can follow you. I mean, that's pretty prescient on his part to see that things are going that way. He continues, "We have already reached a point where remedial control, born out of knowledge of media and their total effects on all of us, must be exerted." He's the one hand, he's sort of welcoming this new world that he sees being created by modern media and the shifts in human consciousness and human forms of life that he thinks naturally go along with it. But at the same time, he is alarmed. The need for remedial control, the need to, let's say, preserve privacy. How shall the new environment be programmed now that we have become so involved with each other? Now that all of us have become the unwitting workforce for social change. What's that buzzing? Maybe he's ambivalent, that's quite possible. Ambivalent about the changes. On the one hand, the older forms of thinking are naturally going to be eclipsed. They're going to go out of fashion and no longer be around. But something else might be lost, or something might be lost through that transition that we want to preserve. For instance, our notions of privacy. McLuhan once, and he was a joker, he once said that public transportation in America would never succeed, really, because um, being alone in your car is the only time when Americans actually have quiet time with their thoughts. He put it in a much more funny way than that. He delivered it much better, but it was a joke, but it was also kind of true. That there's something precious. I'm not a driver myself, but I know for a lot of people I know, there's that time alone in the car where they don't have, they're not being washed over, is an important time for them. Some me time or some alone time or some thinking time, which is, the idea is that it's threatened in the modern world. A quiet time where we can actually think things through. I mean, so on the one hand, he is very optimistic and joyful how things are changing. Family is changing. The notion of your neighborhood, certainly your education is changing, your job, all these things are changing. Government's changing. Look at that. Wonderful. Grant Wood painting American Gothic, but at the same time, he's anticipating dangers. I mean, some things are good, right? I mean, like the others thing, right? The shock of recognition in an electric information environment. I mean, that could describe today's internet world. Minority groups can no longer be contained, ignored. Too many people know too much about each other. Our new environment compels commitment and participation. We have become irrevocably involved with and responsible for each other. I mean, maybe that's why he chose this American Gothic image, which seems, encapsulates or represents or symbolizes a certain type of closed-minded provincial American type of thinking, which is no longer possible, right? Because this guy lived in a very small world. We live in a world in which we can't ignore the others. We can't ignore other types of people in the way that they think, and they make demands upon us. Now, of course, okay, one of the problems today is that there are plenty of people like this guy and this woman who live in a bubble, right? That was the idea of tribal epistemologies, which is, but maybe McLuhan can't see that far ahead. I mean, for him, the electric information environment breaks down provincialism, breaks down barriers, breaks down tribalisms and prejudices, because it forces us to acknowledge each other. One of his points is, one of the reasons for all the social unrest in the 60s is that it's harder to fool people these days, because they know how other people live, like poor people know how rich people live today, and perhaps the way they didn't before. It's all over the media. And so they make demands, which I would say is a really good thing, right? All right, so enjoy this book. There's a lot here. It does introduce a lot of the fundamental themes in a great way. You don't have to read every word. It's not a book that's meant to be read that way. Dip into this thing about, the Renaissance discovery of perspective and painting, and see how it relates to these other things. And some things you have to put in a mirror to read them. It's ideas about space and time being obliterated, and the global village, the idea of television bringing us all together in this sort of way that wasn't even possible before, sort of recreates the earlier form of life and entertainment and information transmission and storytelling. Just really incredible. Okay, so next week we'll begin reading they're still funny and jokey, but more traditionally written, Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man.